well, I spent 2 years in Honduras, in America Central, working in kind of the mountainous area on nutrition rehabilitation with a health project. And there I worked with people who were doing teaching, using really liberation theological methods to teach literacy and agriculture and various things. And I became very moved by liberation theology and came back to this country and did a master's degree in social work, but also kept working on U.S. policy in Central America constantly. That was always a part of my focus. And as a result of that, became the director of the Washington, D.C. office of something called the Center for Global Education, which is actually at Augsburg College, and it's the organization that brings delegations from Seattle University to Nicaragua every year. Mm-hmm. And I directed their D.C. office for about 7 years and brought delegations of people to Central America and Mexico for really immersion experiences to get a sense of what was going on in those countries. And we had them meeting with all sectors of society, from the guerrillas in the montaña to the military officials that were hunting them down, and the rich to the poor. And this was during the war years, so there were people we met with whose lives were always at risk. And there were church people who were in solidarity with the poorest of the poor, and their lives were at risk for doing that. So that moved me increasingly towards the power of theology to look at justice issues and make a difference. And ultimately, I just had to study again because I loved it. And the way to combine theology and progressive political activism was Christian ethics. And so that's why I chose Christian ethics to do the doctoral degree in. I saw the impact in the base ecclesial communities, the comunidades de base, when people became aware of the fact that they were beloved people of God and that God wanted a life of wholeness and health for all people, and the extent to which that then motivated and nurtured and encouraged people to struggle for justice for themselves and for others, in spite of, it never impressed me so much that people would risk death. I've risked my life, and I did in those circumstances. That never impressed me so much as the fact that people would risk being picked up and tortured by paramilitary officials because they were in solidarity with poor people struggling for their rights. That always blew my mind, that people would take that kind of risk. And so many people in the church did that, just simply grounded in their faith. And I really wanted to study theology because I wanted to just plumb the depths of Christian traditions for its wellsprings of moral power and spiritual power to work toward a life where all people can have justice and joy. Because there is such a history in Christian traditions well, there's a terrible history in Christian tradition of siding with the oppressors. I mean, the church has been a force for oppression throughout history, the Crusades, the Inquisition, theologically underwriting slavery, etc. But at the same time, the church has also been in a lesser known way, a force for standing up to systemic domination. And I wanted to learn more what that was about and understand that force, that power. And so that was really what led me to theological ethics. I had no idea that I would go into the academy and become a teacher. I didn't know that, no. But I met very powerful teachers. During my doctoral work, I saw the extent to which teachers could really make a profound difference in helping students to find their calling in life and live it into the world. And I value that, and that's part of what brought me to teaching. I'm actually deeply moved by the extent to which students on this campus want to help to build a better world. I see so much compassion and empathy and desire to be a part of building a better world. And I think there's a real challenge in discerning where your gifts are, what your leanings, your abilities are, and what you love to do, and how that connects with the world's needs. There's someone who wrote, Frederick Buechner wrote something like, where your passions and the world's needs meet, there is your vocation. And maybe that's a little idealistic, but I think there's real truth to that. And then there's also always the nitty-gritty hard work of finding the doors to knock on and knocking on those doors to be able to live your passions into a field of work. And I think that's one of the roles of mentors, faculty and others, to mentor students and help them find the right doors to knock on and support them in doing that. So I think listening to one's gifts and listening to one's passions and doing astute social analysis, social ecological analysis for what are the needs of the world, and then also drawing upon mentors for advice and for support. Those are some of the parts of that discernment process. I would hope that everyone in discerning vocation bears in mind that that humankind is faced with this moral crisis that we've never before faced. And we have a few years to determine as a species what direction we're going. And that is the moral crisis of climate change. And it really seems to me that every single field of human endeavor has something to contribute. You know, from the social sciences to the natural sciences to the humanities to technological knowledge. And so it would seem to me that in thinking about vocation, one of the questions to ask is, how can my calling, in whatever direction it is, how can it help us move toward sustainable Earth-human relations, as opposed to continuing with massively unsustainable Earth-human relations? I think that walking through life, being astutely aware of certain things is really crucial. And I think it's really important to walk through life, be you a student, be you a faculty, be you whatever, looking for the hidden impacts of our lives, the hidden injustice that whenever you're in a position of privilege, you don't see. So for a white person, that it's important that I walk through life looking for white privilege, always rearing its head, so that I can try to be a part of undoing it. Or class privilege, being a person, a highly educated person with a decently secure job, that I need to be watching for all those dynamics of class privilege so I can try to be an ally and stand up against them. I really think walking through life looking for the hidden injustices that we don't see when we're not hurting from them is part of being a responsible adult. And so one of the things that I do is at the beginning of a term, I ask my students to put a question in their minds. And it's a long question. I say it's the only thing that I'm going to quote that I want you to write down. But it's a question of what in any given situation, as you're walking through the day, what is presupposed uncritically to be natural or normal or inevitable or God's will that might in fact just be a social construct. And so with that, I try to keep that question in my mind, because we assume all kinds of things are natural or normal or just the way things are, that in fact are constructed. So as a society, we assume it's natural or normal or inevitable to be driving cars. And lo and behold, great big, even our small cars are great big hunks of metal chasing down the road with one person in them. So we assume that to be the way things are, when if you were standing up on Mars and looking down at it, it would look like an absolute absurdity. So, and that's just a tiny example, but all kinds of things we assume to be, we accept as normal, that we should be questioning as we go through life. So that's one of the things I just try to say, be aware of as a part of responsible humanness. Structural evil it's a very controversial term. And I've had a lot of people say, why did you use that word in your book, or in the title of your book? And I do use it partly to raise attention, resisting structural evil. And maybe describing what I mean by structural evil is most easily done by stories. There are certain stories that illustrate structural evil to me. One I can think of is when I was bringing a delegation of local elected officials from different states and cities around the country to Mexico. And we were meeting with a strawberry picker, a woman who picks strawberries. And she said with such depth and not blame or shame, she said, this land, she said, our children go hungry because this land grows strawberries for your tables, and it should be growing corn and beans for our children. And the fact that when I go to the grocery store, my food is rendering certain other people horribly exploited is an example of structural evil. I don't want to hurt other people. None of the kind, caring, good Americans that go to the grocery store want to be hurting other people, and yet that's an example of that. Or that our meat is creating enormous amounts of greenhouse gases, but we don't want to make the greenhouse gases. So that our lives are wound up in those kinds of structures that hurt other people in order to provide what we have, even though we might want our lives to be serving the good. That's what I mean by structural evil. One of the other examples that is just emblazed in my heart was working with the World Council of Churches at the UN. I was with a delegation from the World Council of Churches, and there were 12 people from around the world on this delegation. We were following I think it was the 10th anniversary of the World Summit on Social Development. And one of our members, we were sitting around the table and introducing ourselves. And we came to one man who was from Mozambique. He was a bishop, a Methodist bishop. And all he said was, I am Bishop Bernardino Mandlate from Mozambique, and I am a debt warrior. That's all he said, period. And by that he meant the external debt, the debt that Mozambique, like many, many highly impoverished countries, owe to the financial institutions and nations of the wealthier world, that was and still continues to suck enormous amounts of money out of those countries. So he dedicates his faith life to being a warrior against the debt, to get the debt canceled, because children in Mozambique were dying, because money didn't go to food and education and health care for them. It went to finance the debt. So then he was giving a talk. He was chosen by our delegation to give an address. And the address that he was asked to give had to do with the sources or the causes of hunger in Africa. And I'll never forget, because one of the lines he said was, he said, the food of American children is covered with the blood of African children. And that was what he meant. He was describing the impact of the debt, that our economic well-being was partly based upon receiving these debt payments from countries that, by losing that money, was deadly for so many poor people. So that would be another example of structural evil. None of us want that to be the impact of how we live. And I could give you, I've worked in Africa and Asia and Europe and Latin America with people who have told me so many of these stories. or I've watched them. And so when I talk about structural evil, I really mean the public policies, the corporate policies, the economic systems, the military systems, the worldviews, the assumptions that set it up so that some people's lives require the exploitation of other people and require the or result in the kind of climate change that we're seeing. Yeah. When I was in India working on eco-justice issues, I learned from my colleagues there what I hadn't known, and that was that there were currently 25 million environmental refugees, people displaced by climate change or by environmental issues, and realized there that most of them are African and Asian, and yet climate change is caused primarily by the wealthy, the global north, descendants of Europe. And that, to me, is another example of the racial implications of climate change. And that being another example of structural evil. I really feel strongly that it's immoral to ask people to look at and be aware of structural evil unless you're also going to ask people or enable people to see the ways to change it. And so I do believe that opening our eyes to structural injustice, structural evil could be seen as a theological way to talk about structural injustice, that we need to see it more clearly, and at the same time, and no less important, see the paths for social transformation. And I have enormous hope. And it's partly because there are people, groups, individuals, links, networks all over the world, including in our own country, including in our own city, who are really committed to changing the nature of the global economy. You know, okay, audacious that sounds, but advanced global capitalism cannot continue as it is because the Earth can't sustain it. So we won't go on with a massively growth-based, fossil-fueled economy. That's not within the physical possibilities. And there are many people on many levels creating alternatives. And to me, that is mind-blowingly terrific. And it helps, I think, to kind of break down that whole movement into pieces and parts in order to best see how to fit into it. And one of the ways that I do that is think about change. I mean, given that we must effect radical change in the way we live on Earth, that we must. You know, the fact that the fossil fuel economy isn't going to go on. I like to think about change on 4 levels. That is, one of them is lifestyle. Let me say differently, households and individuals, the way our lifestyle changes. Secondly is institutions, like Seattle University, institutions of civil society. The third is the corporate level, that the nature of business, and particularly the nature of large business, can change radically, dramatically. Business can play a tremendous role in moving towards a more just and sustainable economy. And the fourth level is governance, public policy. So to me, it's so helpful to see the links between those. So when people make lifestyle changes, that can be moving towards public policy changes and corporate changes. All of these 4 dance together. And many people will say we need change on just one level, but that's not the case. They all have a role to play. And I like to think about what are the basic, if one has a vision of a moral economy, a vision of, let's say, an economy in which all people have the necessities for life with dignity and Earth's life systems can flourish, and no one accumulates massive wealth at the expense of others. If that's one's vision, what are some of the principles that would lead to realizing that vision? And so I can name a few principles. Economic democracy would be one. Ecological sustainability, that would be fitting human economies into the Earth's economy. A third would be economic equity, that is not prioritizing concentration of wealth over meeting human needs. And a fourth would be ecological equity. That is watching how much environmental space we take up. But then if you have a vision for a moral economy and principles that would lead to it, then the question is, what are public policies that enable those principles to be realized? And then we can start identifying many public policies under, being generated and already in place towards those principles. And finally, what are the human practices that help those policies to be realized? What are the forms of action, I call them? And I think of about 10 different forms of action that people can take. So at any rate, I think it helps to break down the process of change into its components. I was going to say, I really find one source of hope is my students. There is passion and commitment and integrity. There's hard work. There is a will to overcome obstacles. We have students on this campus with a lot of obstacles. Students working 30 hours a week and going to school full time and taking care of a younger sister or something like that. But I'm often struck by the fact that when I look at the students walking around the campus, that this generation has been dumped with a load, a huge load that they didn't ask for and they didn't create. And that's the load of reversing climate change and reversing the gap in access to wealth, access to the necessities for life with dignity. And so what on earth, what do we do with the fact that the generations walking around our campus, the student generations, the faculty generations, are the ones that need to deal with this unprecedented task. So one of the things that I feel faculty are responsible for is taking the students' beautiful desires to make a world in which people can all flourish, and helping students develop the skills to do that, the knowledge, the insights. And what's ironic about that is that we don't have necessarily the knowledge or the insights to give. It's a matter of enabling students to, along with ourselves, to create the knowledge, to generate the questions, to create the knowledge, to uncover the wisdom, the technological wisdom, the moral wisdom, the spiritual wisdom, the keys to forging a sustainable future for this planet. So in other words, faculty need to help students accomplish what we failed to accomplish thus far as a generation. It's quite a challenge for both the student and the faculty populations to work together to uncover what we need to uncover in terms of abilities and motivations and wisdom to get to a good future. The subtitle of the book is Love as Ecological Economic Vocation. And by that I mean that the principal moral norm of Christian, Jewish, and Muslim traditions is this norm of love thy neighbor as thyself, or otherwise translated, at least in the Christian Bible, the text that we translate as love thy neighbor as thyself is also equally well translated as love thy neighbor as God loves. The point being, what does that mean? So like 2 millennia of Christians and the Hebrew people before them struggled to understand, what does love thy neighbor as God loves or as thyself mean in every new time and place? And that is the challenge before these religious traditions today, to say, what does that mean? And it doesn't mean what a Hallmark card says. It doesn't necessarily mean feeling anything. it has profound meaning, and we won't go into all of that there, but part of it has to do with serving the well-being of self and neighbor and earth. In today's world, we would see the neighbor, the scope of the neighbor has expanded from just the human to the other than human also. And biblical witness certainly attests to that. Now we have a whole series of texts enabling us to read the Bible from the perspective of the earth. So if you read the Bible from the perspective of the earth, you find a lot of fuel for perceiving the neighbor as other than just the human. I've worked on a number of projects for the World Council of Churches, and the most recent project was one in which the World Council, together with the Lutheran World Federation and the World Alliance of Reformed Churches, 3 global ecumenical networks, came together to create a plan for their ongoing work in an area that they've all been working, and that is in seeking transformation in the global financial architecture. Yes, that sounds audacious, but the World Council of Churches has for 30 years been very, very an active voice in civil society, seeking to question the power of transnational corporations, seeking to hold up their impact on people who are impoverished, and questioning the whole neoliberal paradigm, questioning deregulation. So these 3 bodies, led by the World Council of Churches, came together and decided to create a plan for the next years of their advocacy around justice in the global economy. The way they call it is transformation in the global financial architecture. And so they pulled together a panel of 12 people, mostly economists, but a few theologians, and I was asked to be the theologian. I was the North American theologian, and we met over a period of, about 8 months, met in Geneva, and then worked in our various locations, and then met again in Geneva, and produced a plan to present to the World Council of Churches and the other 2 organizations to guide their work around in that area. And it was fascinating. Some of the people on the panel were just amazing in their histories, the gifts that they brought, and also amazing in their fundamental humility. There were no big egos that were out there to make the name for themselves. It was just very powerfully collaborative teamwork, including people from all of the world's continents except I guess you would say Antarctica didn't have anyone. Yeah. Mm-hmm. It's a beautiful, beautiful example of both really prophetic, and by prophetic we mean pushing towards social change in the name of justice. It's a mixture of that and really strong, pragmatic nuts and bolts of economic change.